Hello,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today.
Well, thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I missed the last time we were supposed to get together.
No, not at all. I'm glad this worked out. So first, could you please tell me about your background and the reason that you chose to become a curator and how you got to where you are today?
Okay, well, my background is I'm trained as a historian, and I started off as a history professor at a university in Maryland. I had a chance to take a year's leave of absence and work at the National Museum of American History. And as I tell people, I started there to be there for a year and wound up being there for 20 years. So that's how I wound up becoming a curator. There, I worked at a variety of levels. There's a historian for a while, and then I worked as an archivist. During that time, I created an exhibition called Field to Factory, which looked at African American migration from the South to the North. It allowed me to then shift to become a curator. I then became a supervisor. I then became deputy director, and then became the director of the museum for about almost 10 years. I left there to go work at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, where I was there for 7 years as the president and CEO. And then I came back east to work at George Mason University, where I am the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of History, actually, Clarence J. Robinson Professor of African American, American, and Public History, but history is shorter and more compact. During that time, I also had a chance to work as a guest curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, working on one of their permanent exhibitions, one that looks at what we call the era of segregation from 1876 to the first inauguration of President Obama. And then after working on that, I was asked to be a guest curator on an exhibition we're working on now called Reconstruction. And over the last 18 months, I served as the acting director at the National Museum of African American History and Culture until they selected a permanent director last January. And now I'm back at George Mason University teaching history and classes on museums.
That's incredible. You've obviously had such a lengthy and evolved experience working at all of these different institutions. I was
Absolutely.
wondering, as you've been working on, as you've like come across these different roles and curated different shows, what kind of themes have you found yourselves coming into contact with, or you know, have been recurring in your work?
What kind of themes?
Yeah, curatorial themes.
Well, for me, my primary interest is in African American history and culture. So the themes that I tend to follow are works that allow us to have stronger insight into the African American impact on American society and on American culture. So as you can tell, the exhibition I did was on African American migration from the South to the North, which was a tremendous shift in the demographic center of the African American community, but also how the nation has to think about the issues of race, because now it's not just a Southern issue, it is a Northern issue. And certainly the work I did for the museum focused on the era of segregation, really began to help us better understand how after the end of enslavement that there continued to be major efforts to prevent African Americans from having full citizenship and full rights in the nation. So those are the things that continue to, I think, get my attention. And as the director of American history, the idea was to begin to broaden the story of American history that's presented to the public. So again, they have a clear sense of how the contributions of African Americans have really helped make this nation unique in important kinds of ways.
That's incredible. I saw as well as I was just doing some research on you that one of your aims as a curator was to, as you said, make history accessible to the public as well as through innovative and inclusive exhibitions. And I wanted to ask you if you could go in depth a bit more about how you execute that when you are, going through the process from establishing what the next exhibition you're working on to the final product.
Well, I think the idea, particularly when you're trying to look at African American history, is one, to create a sense in our communities that, in fact, the material culture and the objects that are part of our lives are an important part of the history of the country. And the challenge is to have people see those as valuable and want them to be in museums and in museum exhibitions. Because what we try to remind folks is that, especially at a museum, the objects are a critical part of the storytelling. And without the objects, it makes it harder to tell the story in the kind of rich, diverse ways that you want to. So part of it is spreading that word and getting our community to more and more see the value of the things that they are control. The other part of it, I believe, is to really make the personal stories an important part of the presentation, because what that does is to allow all visitors to feel a connection to what's taking place. It's much more powerful to hear about how an individual woman has to struggle for work or struggle to take care of her family, as opposed to give them a whole array of statistics to talk about things in general. So I think in creating exhibitions and trying to make them engaging and innovative, it is to make the day-to-day lives of people who are living that history come to life, and to make them resonate for the visitors in ways that connections are made, and people can understand better what are the connections that exist between all of us in our society.
That's amazing. And as you kind of come to terms with this being your driving mission, has there been a specific exhibition or a specific curator that you yourself have kind of been inspired by as you have been developing your own kind of path?
Well, certainly the Field to Factory exhibition for me was seminal, because it really sort of was the very first major exhibition that I created. It really seemed to have a very strong impact in the field as well as for those who came to visit it. So that for me was a critical exhibition in terms of how I thought about doing exhibitions and the kind of impact I could see that it could have. I guess if there is a curator who I respect and really think highly of, it is the current Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch. He and I have been colleagues and friends for going back to the 1980s, and working with him always helps me to look at things in new ways, to sort of spur our mutual creative juices and allow us, I think, to do work that's better as a result of that interaction. So for me, he's a critical person in terms of, I think, my personal growth and my sensitivity to how to approach these issues.
And over the past decade or so, how have you seen kind of like the roles and responsibilities of a curator shift and transform, especially as we've moved into, the oversaturation of the digital age and trying to keep the importance of archives alive?
Well, I think the key thing is thinking through the modes of presentation that one has to take into consideration in creating exhibitions. There was a time when you just had to have the objects and you'd have a good background and that was enough. But I think given today's audiences and the kind of world in which they live, in which media and other things are all around them, as a curator, you have to think of the different ways in which you want to engage your visitors. I think curators need to work more closely with educators and people who sort of are advocates for the audience, so that as one is crafting an exhibition, that you're keeping in mind all the different ways in which people learn, all the different ways in which things can be perceived and taken in, and trying to take that into account as you're crafting and creating an exhibition. I think you also have to think more richly about the kinds of objects that you want to bring into the collection, and to think beyond sort of traditional pathways and really think creatively about what kinds of objects, what kind of things that may not seem really important at the moment may become much more important in the future as new techniques, new points of view, new ways of examining things come to the forefront. I think we cannot predict where media and the technology will take us in the future. And it's important to think richly about that, so that what you collect, which may not seem as valuable at the moment, might have great value going into the future. So you have to be much more thoughtful and forward thinking, I think, in terms of the work that you do.
And you kind of touched on this already in this question, but just moving forward, what would be one piece of advice that you would give to emerging curators trying to enter the space as something to consider moving forward?
I think the key thing I would push towards them is the idea of collaboration. working with others who are both scholars, who are both educators, who are designers. I think what makes for a good experience for the visitor is the collaboration between a variety of individuals who offer different perspectives that result in an exhibition or a presentation that's very rich and very rewarding for those who are connected to it.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Spencer, for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thank you for your patience with me.
Of course, no worries.